He only meant to test her with a harmless question. But the moment the waitress answered, the entire restaurant fell silent. And for the first time in years, billionaire McCrae felt completely exposed. Hello beautiful souls and welcome to Ms. Love Stories channel. The place where love, drama, and unforgettable moments come alive. I'm so thrilled you're here, ready to dive into stories that will make your heart race, bring tears, and leave you believing in the power of love. Before we begin, I want to get to know all of you. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because in the next video, I'll give a special shout out to some of you amazing viewers from around the world. I can't wait to see how far our love story family reaches. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, so you never miss a single emotional journey. Get ready to feel, laugh, cry, and fall in love all over again, because every story we share here is for you. Now, the story begins. Rose. The chandeliers in the grand dining hall shimmered like frozen stars, casting golden light over polished marble floors and tables dressed in pristine white linen. Every movement in the restaurant was controlled, deliberate, refined. And then there was Betty. She moved quickly, almost invisibly, weaving through the sea of wealth with a tray balanced on one hand and quiet determination in her eyes. Her uniform was spotless, but her shoes told another story, worn at the edges, softened by long hours and longer days. Table 6 needs their wine, her manager whispered sharply as she passed. I already poured it, Betty replied calmly, not breaking stride. She wasn't just surviving here. She was watching, learning, enduring. Because for Betty, this wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. Across the room, seated at the most reserved corner table, was a man who didn't belong to the noise of the world. McCrae. Even in a room filled with power and wealth, his presence was different. Quiet, controlled, almost detached. His suit was perfectly tailored, his watch subtle yet worth more than most people's yearly income. But it wasn't his appearance that set him apart. It was his silence. While others laughed too loudly and spoke too freely, McCrae simply observed. Calculated. Measured. Untouchable. A billionaire CEO who had built empires from nothing. And trust from no one. Sir, your guests are running late, his assistant murmured. They're not late, McCrae replied without looking up from his glass. They're testing my patience. His tone was calm, but final, because McCrae didn't wait for people. People waited for him. Betty approached his table cautiously, sensing the invisible barrier around him. She had seen men like him before, men who believed the world existed to serve them. But something about this one was different. Good evening, sir, she said softly, placing a glass of water before him. Would you like to order while you wait? McCrae didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked up. And for a brief second, their eyes met. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, but it did. Betty held his gaze longer than most people dared to, not out of defiance, but out of something deeper, dignity. And McCrae noticed. Most people avoided his eyes. They lowered their gaze, shifted uncomfortably, tried too hard to impress. But not her. She stood there, calm, steady, unafraid. It irritated him. And intrigued him, at the same time. What's your name? McCrae asked, his voice low and unreadable. Betty, she replied. No hesitation. No nervous smile. Just truth. McCrae leaned back slightly, studying her now. Not as a waitress, but as a variable. An unknown. And McCrae didn't like unknowns. You don't seem nervous, he said. A simple observation. But it carried weight. Betty gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Should I be? The question lingered in the air. Sharp. Unexpected. And for a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. McCrae's fingers tapped lightly against the table. Not out of impatience, but curiosity. You're standing in front of someone who could change your life with a single decision, he said. Most people would be careful. Betty tilted her head slightly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, not awe, something stronger. Or maybe, she said quietly, most people forget that they can change their own lives too. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that settles deep and refuses to leave. McCrae didn't respond. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because, for the first time in a very long time, someone had said something he didn't expect. And that unsettled him. Betty gently placed the menu in front of him. "Take your time, sir," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll be right here when you're ready." She turned and walked away. Just like that. No lingering. No attempt to impress. No second glance. And somehow, that was exactly what made McCrae watch her leave. Across the room, laughter resumed. Glasses clinked. Conversations carried on as if nothing had happened. But something had. McCrae leaned forward slightly, his gaze following Betty as she moved between tables, effortlessly balancing grace and exhaustion. There was something beneath the surface. Something hidden. And he wanted to find it. Because McCrae didn't believe in coincidences. And something told him, this girl wasn't one. Meanwhile, behind the kitchen doors, Betty exhaled slowly, pressing her palm briefly against the counter. Her co-worker nudged her. "What was that about?" she whispered. "That's McCrae. The McCrae." Betty shook her head slightly. "Just another customer." But her voice betrayed her, because her heart was beating just a little faster. She wasn't afraid of him, but she felt something. A shift. A moment that didn't fit into the ordinary rhythm of her life. And deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Have you ever had a single moment, a single conversation, that completely changed how someone saw you? Tell me in the comments, because what's coming next will test everything you believe about pride, power, and love. As Betty stepped back onto the floor, McCrae lifted his glass, but didn't drink. His mind wasn't on the meeting anymore. It wasn't on business, or power, or control. It was on one thing. A waitress, who didn't act like she needed anything from him. And for a man who had everything, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The restaurant had returned to its rhythm. Forks clinking softly against porcelain, quiet laughter drifting through candlelit air, the hum of wealth pretending to be normal. But at table 1, nothing felt normal anymore. McCrae hadn't touched the menu. Not because he didn't know what he wanted, but because his attention wasn't on the food. It was on her. Across the room, Betty moved like she always did, efficient, composed, invisible to those who didn't bother to look closely. But McCrae was looking closely now. Too closely. "Sir," his assistant leaned in again, voice cautious this time. "Your investors just arrived." McCrae didn't turn. "Seat them." The assistant hesitated. "Should I?" "I said seat them." His tone ended the conversation. But even as 3 sharply dressed men approached the table, all smiles and handshakes, McCrae's focus didn't shift completely. A part of him stayed with Betty. "McCrae." One of the investors laughed, extending his hand. "Always a pleasure." McCrae stood, shook hands, exchanged formalities, but his eyes flickered just once over the man's shoulder, looking for her. "Let's order," another investor said, picking up the menu. "I hear this place has the best." "I already have someone in mind," McCrae interrupted calmly. And then, he raised his hand slightly. Betty saw it immediately. She didn't rush. She never rushed for anyone. But she walked toward the table with steady steps, her expression neutral, controlled, professional. "Sir," she said, stopping beside them. "Are you ready to order?" McCrae didn't look at the menu, didn't look at his guests. He looked at her. "Yes," he said slowly. "But first, I have a question." The table went still. One of the investors chuckled lightly. "A question? About the menu?" McCrae's gaze never left Betty. No. Something shifted in the air. Subtle, but heavy. Betty felt it too. Her fingers tightened slightly around the notepad she held, but her face didn't change. "Go ahead, sir." McCrae leaned forward just a fraction. Not aggressive, not loud, but intentional. "Let's say," he began, his voice smooth but edged with something deeper. "You're given a choice." The investors exchanged amused glances. But Betty didn't look at them. Only him. "A single decision," McCrae continued. That could instantly change your life. Money, comfort, security. Everything you've ever struggled for. The words landed softly, but their weight was undeniable. Betty didn't respond. Not yet. McCrae studied her carefully, measuring, waiting. And all you have to do, he added, is say yes. A pause. Would you take it? Silence. The kind that spreads, table to table, like something invisible had just been dropped into the center of the room. One of the investors smirked. That's not much of a question. Anyone would say yes. Another nodded, especially in her position. Betty heard them. Of course she did. But she didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed on McCrae. Because the question wasn't really about money. And somehow, she knew that. McCrae waited, expecting hesitation, gratitude, maybe even desperation. But what he got instead was something he hadn't prepared for. Betty placed her notepad gently on the table, not defensive, not submissive, just deliberate. Then she spoke. No. The word didn't echo. It didn't need to. Because the silence that followed was louder than anything else in the room. The investors froze. One of them actually laughed, short, confused. Wait, what? But Betty didn't repeat herself. McCrae's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. Explain, he said quietly. Betty took a small breath. Not to steady fear, but to choose her words. Because anything that costs me my choice, she said, her voice calm but unshakable, isn't really a gift. Another silence. Deeper this time. The investors shifted in their seats. Uncomfortable now. That's not what he meant, one of them said quickly. He's talking about opportunity. People would kill for that kind of. Would they? Betty interrupted gently. Not rude, not aggressive, but precise. She turned her gaze slightly, just enough to acknowledge the table, but not enough to lose her focus. Or have they just been taught to? No one answered. McCrae's fingers, resting on the table, stilled completely. Betty continued, softer now. I work here because I need to, she said. Not because I don't have choices. Her eyes returned fully to his. And I won't trade one kind of struggle for another that looks prettier. The words landed like quiet thunder. A glass slipped somewhere in the distance. No one turned. Because every eye, every single one, was now on table one. On her. And on him. McCrae leaned back slowly. Not dismissive. Not impressed. But affected. For the first time in years, he didn't have control of the moment. Interesting, he said finally. But his voice was different now. Less certain. Betty picked up her notepad again. The moment, at least for her, was over. Are you ready to order now, sir? She asked, as if nothing had happened. The investors stared at her, speechless. McCrae didn't answer immediately. Instead, he held her gaze for one more second. And in that second, something unspoken passed between them. Not attraction. Not yet. Recognition. Bring me whatever you recommend, McCrae said quietly. Betty nodded once. Of course. And just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a table full of men who suddenly felt smaller than they had before. McCrae. One of the investors said slowly, still processing. What just happened? McCrae didn't respond. Because his mind wasn't on the deal anymore. It wasn't on power, or influence, or control. It was on one thing. A waitress, who said no. And meant it. What would you have done in that moment? Taken the offer, or protected your independence like Betty did? Be honest, I'm reading your answers. Across the room, Betty disappeared behind the kitchen doors again. But this time, she didn't pause, didn't exhale, didn't second guess. Because she already knew. That moment was going to change something. She just didn't know what. And at table one, McCrae stared at the empty space she left behind. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking like a billionaire. He was thinking like a man who had just been challenged. The moment should have ended at the table. A strange exchange. A bold waitress. A question that went nowhere. That's how it should have been. But it didn't. McCrae signed the contract. He shook hands. He said all the right things. And still, he didn't remember a single word of the conversation. "Congratulations, McCrae," one of the investors said, raising his glass. "Another empire secured." McCrae gave a faint nod, but his eyes drifted again. To the floor. To the movement. To her. Betty. She wasn't even looking at him. Not once. And that bothered him more than her answer. Because people always looked at him. Always. With expectation. With need. With calculation. But she didn't. It felt like rejection. And McCrae didn't handle rejection. He controlled it. "Sir," his assistant said cautiously, "the car is ready." McCrae stood, buttoned his jacket, prepared to leave. And yet, he didn't move. Not immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted again, just for a second, looking for her. He found her near the far end of the room, laughing softly with another waitress as she wiped down a table. It wasn't forced. It wasn't polite. It was real. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that irritated him. "She thinks she's different," he muttered under his breath. "Sir," the assistant asked. "Nothing." McCrae turned and walked out. Just like that. Because walking away was what he did best. Behind the kitchen doors, Betty rinsed her hands under cool water, letting it run longer than necessary. Her coworker leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You're either the bravest person I know," she said, "or the most reckless." Betty smiled faintly. "Maybe both." "You told him no," her coworker pressed. "Do you even know who he is?" Betty dried her hands slowly. "Yes." "And you still said no?" Betty turned to face her fully now. There was no pride in her expression. No regret either. "I didn't say no to him," she said quietly. Her coworker frowned. "Then what did you say no to?" Betty hesitated. Just for a second. "To losing myself," she replied. The words settled heavy between them. Her coworker didn't speak again. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about a rich man and a waitress. It was about something deeper. Something harder to explain. Later that night, the restaurant emptied. The lights dimmed, and the illusion of perfection faded into something quieter. Betty stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against her face. For a moment, she just stood there, still. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked, old, but functional. She opened her messages, scrolled, paused. A single contact. Mama Red Heart. Her thumb hovered, then pressed. "Hi, Mama," she said softly as the call connected. A weak but warm voice answered. "Betty, my child." Betty closed her eyes briefly. That voice. It grounded her. "How are you feeling?" Betty asked. "Better today," her mother replied, though the strain in her voice said otherwise. "Did you eat?" Betty smiled faintly. "I'm at work, Mama. I'll eat later." "Don't lie to me," her mother said gently. "You always say that." Betty laughed softly, a real laugh this time. "I'm okay," she said. "I promise." A pause. Then her mother asked, "Did anything unusual happen today?" Betty hesitated. For a moment, she thought about the question, the table, the silence, his eyes. And then she shook her head slightly, even though her mother couldn't see her. "No," she said, "just another day." Because some moments were too complicated to explain. Across the city, inside a sleek, glass-walled penthouse overlooking endless lights, McCrae stood alone. His tie loosened, his jacket discarded, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. He stared out at the skyline, but he wasn't seeing it. He was replaying it. Her voice, her words, her calm. No. McCrae exhaled sharply, annoyed. Ridiculous, he muttered. He picked up the glass, set it down again, didn't drink. Because something about that moment wouldn't let him move on. It didn't make sense. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations, hostile takeovers, boardroom betrayals. None of them stayed with him like this. And yet, a waitress with nothing had managed to get under his skin. McCrae turned away from the window abruptly. I don't care, he said out loud. But the empty room didn't believe him. Because deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't about the question anymore. It was about her answer. And what it revealed. The next morning, the restaurant buzzed again with life. But something had changed. Word had spread. Did you hear? One server whispered. Betty told him no. No way. I'm serious. Right to his face. Heads turned. Eyes followed her. Betty felt it. Of course she did. But she didn't react. Didn't explain. Didn't defend herself. She just worked. Because attention wasn't something she trusted. Around noon, the manager called her into the office. Betty stepped in quietly. You wanted to see me? The manager looked up, his expression unreadable. Yes. A pause. You had an interaction with a guest last night. Betty didn't respond. Do you understand the kind of establishment this is? He continued. We don't challenge our guests. We accommodate them. I didn't challenge him, Betty said calmly. The manager raised an eyebrow. From what I heard, you refused a direct proposition from a high-profile client. Betty held his gaze. I answered a question, she said. Another pause. The manager leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're lucky he didn't complain, he said finally. Men like him don't like being told no. Betty's voice was quiet, but firm. Maybe he needed to hear it. The manager exhaled slowly, shook his head. You're either very brave or very foolish. Betty gave a small, tired smile. I've been called both. Meanwhile, across town, McCrae sat in his office. But not working. His assistant stood by the door, tablet in hand. Your 2 p.m. meeting is ready, sir. McCrae didn't respond. Instead, he asked, find out her name. The assistant blinked. Sir. The waitress from last night. A pause. That's unusual, the assistant said carefully. McCrae finally looked up. Is it? The room went still. Find out, he repeated. And just like that, the line between their worlds began to blur. Do you think McCrae is curious or already falling without realizing it? Tell me honestly, because the next step he takes might change both their lives forever. McCrae leaned back in his chair, eyes distant, mind elsewhere. Because for the first time, he wasn't chasing a deal. He was chasing an answer. And Betty didn't even know it yet. The rain started just before sunset. Not gentle, not quiet, but heavy, like the sky itself had decided to collapse onto the city. Inside the restaurant, the lights glowed warmer than usual, reflecting off wet glass and blurred silhouettes outside. The world beyond the windows looked distant, unreachable. Betty tied her apron tighter around her waist, glancing briefly at the storm. Looks like we're closing early, her coworker said. Maybe, Betty replied, but something in her tone suggested otherwise. Because life had taught her one thing. Storms didn't stop responsibility. They only made it harder. Across town, McCrae stood beside his office window, watching the rain hit the glass in relentless waves. His assistant spoke behind him. Sir, the roads are flooding. We should delay your dinner meeting. McCrae didn't turn. No. Sir. I said no. Because tonight, He wasn't going to let anything interfere. Not even the storm. An hour later, the restaurant doors opened violently as a gust of wind pushed rain inside. Guests rushed in, shaking umbrellas, complaining, laughing nervously. And then, he walked in. McCray. His suit was slightly damp at the shoulders, his hair touched by rain, but his composure remained untouched. Controlled. Precise. But his eyes, they searched. And they found her. Betty stood near the counter, holding a tray, her expression still as she noticed him. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then reality snapped back into place. "Welcome back, sir," she said professionally, as if nothing had ever happened. McCray walked toward her slowly, not rushed, not hesitant. Intentional. "I need a table," he said. Betty nodded. "Of course." But before she could turn, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then, darkness. A collective gasp filled the room. The storm outside roared louder, thunder cracking like the sky was splitting open. Emergency lights flickered on faintly, casting everything in a dim, uneasy glow. "Everyone stay calm," the manager called out. "Backup power should kick in soon." But minutes passed, and nothing happened. The restaurant, once a symbol of control and luxury, was now uncertain, unstable. And suddenly, everyone felt it. Betty moved quickly, guiding guests, calming nerves, her voice steady even as the world around her shifted. McCray watched her. Again. But this time, it wasn't curiosity. It was something else. Respect. "Sir," Betty said, returning to him, "we may need to move guests to the back area. It's safer there during outages." McCray glanced around. At the nervous faces, the dim light, the loss of control. Then back at her. "And you?" he asked. Betty blinked slightly. "I'll be helping everyone." McCray's jaw tightened just a fraction. "That wasn't my question." A pause. Then Betty understood. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. But something in her voice didn't fully convince him. The manager rushed over. "Betty, take a few guests to the staff corridor. We need to keep things organized." She nodded immediately. "Sir," she said to McCray, "you'll need to come with us." McCray didn't argue, didn't question. He followed. The staff corridor was narrow, dimly lit, far from the polished elegance of the dining room. Here, there were no chandeliers, no marble, no illusion. Just concrete walls, soft echoes, and people, stripped of status. Betty guided a small group inside, her movements calm, controlled. McCray stood near the wall, watching everything, taking it in. This wasn't his world. And yet, for the first time, he didn't feel above it. Thunder roared again, closer this time. One of the guests panicked. "Is this place even safe?" Betty stepped forward immediately. "Yes," she said firmly. "You're safe here." Her voice cut through the fear, grounded it. McCray noticed that. Because leadership didn't always come from power. Sometimes, it came from presence. A few minutes later, the corridor grew quieter. The initial panic settled into uneasy stillness. Betty leaned against the wall briefly, exhaling. Just for a second. And in that second, McCray stepped closer. "You're different here," he said. Betty looked at him, confused. "Different how?" McCray gestured slightly. "This isn't your stage. No customers. No expectations." A pause. "And yet you're still the same." Betty studied him for a moment. "I don't change depending on who's watching," she said. McCray's lips pressed together slightly. "Most people do." Betty gave a faint smile. "Then most people are tired." The words landed softly, but deeply. Another crack of thunder. The lights flickered again. Still no power. Time stretched. And in that confined space, with nowhere to go, they were forced into something neither of them planned. Stillness. Why did you come back? Betty asked suddenly. The question hung in the air. McCrae didn't answer immediately. Because the truth wasn't simple. I had business, he said finally. Betty raised an eyebrow slightly. In a storm like this? McCrae met her gaze. Not all business waits. A pause. Then Betty said quietly, or maybe some things don't. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. A child nearby started crying softly. Without thinking, Betty moved toward the sound, kneeling beside the small boy. It's okay, she said gently. The storm will pass. Her voice softened in a way McCrae hadn't heard before. Warm. Protective. Real. The boy sniffled. Are you sure? Betty smiled. Yes, she said. Storms always pass. McCrae watched that moment closely. Because something about it didn't match the image he had built of her. She wasn't just strong. She was kind. And that made her even more dangerous. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. And still, no power. No escape. Just proximity. Just truth. Finally, the manager returned. We'll have to keep everyone here until the storm eases, he announced. It's too dangerous outside. A collective sigh filled the space. Betty nodded, then turned, only to find McCrae still standing there, still watching her. Looks like you're stuck with us, she said lightly. McCrae's response was quiet. I don't mind. And for the first time, Betty wasn't sure if he was talking about the storm, or her. Have you ever been stuck somewhere with someone, and it changed how you saw them completely? Tell me your story below, because this is where everything begins to shift. The storm raged outside. Unpredictable. Uncontrollable. But inside that narrow corridor, something else was building. Slower. Quieter. But just as powerful. Because now, they couldn't walk away. The storm didn't slow. If anything, it grew louder. Wind howling through unseen cracks, rain pounding like fists against the world outside. Inside the staff corridor, time had softened. Voices dropped. People settled. And the distance between strangers began to disappear. Betty sat on a low wooden crate near the wall, her back straight despite the exhaustion creeping into her shoulders. The dim emergency light cast soft shadows across her face, revealing something most people never noticed. Tiredness. Not just from work, but from life. McCrae stood a few feet away, leaning lightly against the cold concrete wall. Still composed. Still controlled. But no longer distant. You don't sit much, do you? He said quietly. Betty glanced up. A small smile tugged at her lips. Not where I come from. McCrae tilted his head slightly. And where is that? The question was simple, but Betty didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands. Calloused. Steady. Somewhere people don't ask questions like that, she said softly. McCrae watched her carefully. That's not an answer. Betty looked back up. And this time, there was something different in her eyes. No, she agreed. It's not. Silence settled again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. A sudden cough echoed from the far end of the corridor. Weak. Strained. Betty turned immediately. Her expression changed in an instant. Mama, she whispered under her breath. McCrae noticed the shift. Sharp. Immediate. Betty stood quickly and moved toward the sound, weaving past seated guests until she reached an older woman resting against the wall. Her mother. McCrae's gaze followed. He hadn't known. Hey, it's okay, Betty said gently, kneeling beside her. Try to breathe slowly. Her mother smiled faintly despite the discomfort. I told you. I'm fine. Betty shook her head softly. You always say that. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small inhaler, and placing it carefully in her mother's hand. McCrae watched the exchange closely. The tenderness, the urgency, the quiet fear behind Betty's calm voice. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't performed. It was real. After a few moments, her mother's breathing steadied. Betty exhaled slowly, relief washing over her face, but only for a second, because she quickly masked it again. That's when she noticed McCrae watching. Their eyes met. And this time, there was no barrier. Just truth. You didn't mention you weren't alone, McCrae said. Betty stood slowly. I don't mention a lot of things. Her tone wasn't defensive, just honest. McCrae stepped closer, not invading, but no longer distant. She's sick. It wasn't a question. Betty nodded once. For a while now. Another pause. Why are you working here? McCrae asked. The question sounded simple, but now, it carried weight. Betty let out a small breath. Because hospitals don't take promises, she said. They take money. The words landed harder than anything she had said before. And for the first time, McCrae didn't have a response ready. A faint tremor ran through the building as thunder cracked again, but neither of them moved. Because something more powerful than the storm was unfolding between them. You could have said yes, McCrae said quietly. Last night. Betty didn't look away. Yes, she said. A beat. But I didn't. McCrae studied her. Even knowing this? He asked, gesturing subtly toward her mother. Betty's jaw tightened slightly. This, she said slowly, is exactly why I didn't. McCrae frowned just slightly. That doesn't make sense. Betty stepped closer now. Not aggressive, but grounded. It does, she said. You just don't live in a world where it has to. Silence. Money fixes problems, McCrae said. Betty shook her head. No, she replied. Money hides them. The words hit deeper than she intended. Because for a brief moment, McCrae's expression changed. Cracked. Just slightly. You think I don't understand struggle? He asked. Betty hesitated. Then, she said the one thing no one ever dared to say to him. I think you forgot it. The corridor went still. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. McCrae stared at her. Not angry, not offended, but exposed. You don't know anything about me, he said, his voice lower now. Betty nodded. You're right, she said. I don't. A pause. But I know what it looks like when someone builds walls so high, they can't see what's outside them anymore. That did it. McCrae looked away. For the first time, he broke eye contact. And that alone said everything. Minutes passed. Quiet. Heavy. Then, McCrae spoke again, but softer this time. My father used to say that. Betty looked at him. What? That if you build something big enough, you won't have to feel anything small. A faint, almost bitter smile touched his lips. I believed him. Betty didn't interrupt, didn't question. She just listened. Because she understood something now. This man wasn't just powerful. He was protecting something. He lost everything, McCrae continued, and I watched it happen. His voice didn't break, but something underneath it did. So I made sure I never would. Betty's expression softened. And did it work? She asked gently. McCrae didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was standing right in front of him. No, he said finally. Silence wrapped around them again, but this time, it wasn't sharp. It was shared. Betty glanced back at her mother, now resting more peacefully. Then back at him. Then maybe, she said quietly, It's not about losing everything. A pause. Maybe it's about learning what actually matters before you do. McCrae looked at her. Really looked this time. And something shifted. Not just curiosity. Not just respect. Something deeper. Connection. But just as quickly as it formed, it trembled. Because truth always comes with weight. From across the corridor, the manager called out, "Power should be back soon." A murmur of relief spread. The moment was ending. The storm, fading. And with it, the fragile space that had allowed them to be real. McCrae straightened slightly, the walls he had lowered, rising again. Betty noticed. Of course she did. Because moments like this never lasted. "Thank you," McCrae said quietly. Betty blinked. For what? A pause. For not saying yes. Her breath caught, just slightly. But she didn't show it. Instead, she gave a small nod. "You're welcome." And just like that, the distance began to return. But something had changed. Irreversibly. Do you think Betty was right? Or was she too harsh on him? Let me know, because what comes next will test everything they just revealed. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then, power returned. The corridor filled with light again. And just like that, the world snapped back into place. Roles. Distance. Control. But inside both of them, something remained. Something unfinished. Because now, they didn't just see each other. They understood something. They weren't ready to face. The lights came back, but something in the room didn't. The corridor emptied slowly as guests were guided back into the restored elegance of the restaurant. Laughter returned, glasses clinked again, and the illusion of control rebuilt itself piece by piece. But for McCrae and Betty, nothing felt the same. They walked out of the corridor last. Not together. Not apart either. Just aware of each other. Back on the dining floor, everything looked exactly as it had before. Perfect. Polished. Untouched. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks. And now, they both knew where to look. "Sir, your table is ready again," the manager said quickly, overly polite now. McCrae nodded. But instead of sitting, he turned. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't loud. But it wasn't a request either. Betty paused. There it was again. That quiet pull. "I'm working," she replied, her tone calm. McCrae held her gaze. "So am I." A beat. Then something unexpected happened. Betty sighed softly and gave in. 5 minutes, she said. McCrae nodded once. That was all he needed. They stepped outside. The rain had softened now, reduced to a steady drizzle that shimmered under streetlights. The air was cool, fresh, almost cleansing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They stood side by side under the restaurant awning, watching the city breathe again. "I don't usually do this," Betty said finally. "Neither do I," McCrae replied. A faint smile touched her lips. "I doubt that." McCrae let out a quiet exhale. "You think you figured me out already?" Betty shook her head. "No," she said. "I think I've seen enough to know you're still figuring yourself out." That earned a real reaction. A small one, but real. McCrae looked at her. Longer this time. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. Betty raised an eyebrow. "Because I said no?" "No," he said. "Because you meant it." A car passed by, tires slicing through shallow water. The world moved, but time between them slowed. "Why didn't you leave?" Betty asked suddenly. McCrae frowned slightly. "After the storm," she clarified. "You could have gone. Most people would have." McCrae thought about it. Really thought. Then he said, "I didn't want to." Simple. Honest. Betty studied him. That's new for you, isn't it? McCrae didn't answer, because it was. A soft breeze passed between them, carrying silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt comfortable. Your mother, McCrae said gently. She needs better care. Betty stiffened slightly. There it was. Reality. I know, she said. I can help, McCrae added. Immediate. Instinctive. Betty shook her head. No. Not harsh, but firm. McCrae's jaw tightened just a fraction. You don't even know what I'm offering. I don't need to, Betty replied. A pause. Because I know what it costs. The words didn't spark tension this time. They revealed something else. Fear. McCrae saw it. You think I'd use it against you, he said. Betty didn't deny it. I think people don't give without expecting something back, she said quietly. McCrae took a step closer. And you think I'm like everyone else. Betty looked at him. I think you've had to be. That hit deeper than before. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was understanding. McCrae ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. You make everything complicated, he said. Betty smiled faintly. No, she said. I just don't make it easy. For a moment, they both laughed. Soft, unexpected. And just like that, something shifted again. Not tension, not conflict. Connection. You should eat, Betty said suddenly, glancing back toward the restaurant. You didn't touch your food. McCrae shrugged slightly. I wasn't hungry. Betty tilted her head. You are now. She disappeared inside briefly, and returned with a simple plate. Not extravagant. Not expensive. Just warm. Chef made this for staff, she said, handing it to him. Nothing fancy. McCrae looked at it, then at her. You're giving me staff food? Betty smiled. I'm giving you real food. McCrae hesitated. Then, he took a bite. And something about that moment felt different. Not because of the food, but because no one had offered him something without expectation in a very long time. It's good, he admitted. Betty shrugged. Of course it is. It's honest. They stood there a little longer, sharing silence, sharing space. And for once, neither of them felt the need to fill it. Inside, the manager peeked through the glass, watching nervously. But neither of them noticed. Because for the first time, they weren't playing roles. He wasn't a billionaire. She wasn't a waitress. They were just two people, standing in the quiet after a storm. Betty, McCrae said softly. She looked at him. Yeah. A pause. Longer than expected. I'd like to see you again, he said. No pressure. No control. Just honesty. Betty's heart skipped. Just once. But she didn't rush to answer. Because this mattered. We already see each other, she said lightly. McCrae shook his head. No, he said. Not like this. Another pause. Then Betty looked away briefly. At the street. At the fading rain. At the world she knew. And the one standing beside her. Maybe, she said finally. Not yes. Not no. But something in between. Something real. McCrae nodded. He understood. Because for the first time, he wasn't trying to win. He was willing to wait. Have you ever met someone who made you feel safe, but also scared at the same time? Tell me below. Because what's coming next might break everything they just built. A distant rumble of thunder echoed one last time. The storm was ending. But something else was just beginning. Because connection always comes with a cost. And neither of them were ready for what that cost would be. The rain stopped, but the calm that followed was deceptive. Inside the restaurant, everything looked normal again. Guests smiling, waiters moving gracefully, soft music filling the air. But beneath that polished surface, tension simmered. McCrae returned to his table, but he didn't sit immediately. Because for the first time in years, he didn't want to go back to who he was before stepping outside. "Sir," his assistant approached carefully, voice lower than usual. "There's something you need to see." McCrae's expression hardened instantly. "Not now. It can't wait." A beat. McCrae took the tablet from him. And in that moment, everything changed. The headline glared back at him. Billionaire CEO McCrae accused of manipulating restaurant staff for personal gain. Below it, a photo. Him, standing close to Betty, outside the restaurant. Taken without context, without truth. Just enough to twist reality. McCrae's jaw tightened. "This is absurd," he muttered. But the damage was already done. Across the room, whispers began to spread. "Is that her? That's the waitress. Of course. I knew something was off." Eyes turned. Judgment formed. And Betty felt it. The shift. The weight. The sudden change in how the room looked at her. Her steps slowed. Her hands tightened around the tray. "What's going on?" her coworker whispered. Betty shook her head slightly. "I don't know." But deep down, she already did. McCrae looked up and saw her. Saw the confusion in her eyes. The way the room was turning against her. And for the first time, he hesitated. Because stepping in now would only make it worse. And stepping back would hurt her. "McCrae," one of the investors said quietly, leaning in, "you need to distance yourself from this. Immediately." Another added, "This could destroy your image if it escalates." McCrae's grip tightened on the tablet. "Handle it," he said coldly. "Already in motion," his assistant replied. "We'll release a statement, deny everything, of course." A pause. "And the girl?" the assistant asked carefully. McCrae didn't answer. Because in that moment, he made a choice. Betty walked toward the kitchen, trying to ignore the stares, the whispers, the sudden coldness in the air. But she didn't make it far. "Betty." She stopped. Turned. McCrae stood a few steps away. For a second, relief flickered in her eyes. Until she saw his face. Controlled. Distant. The walls were back. Stronger than ever. "What's happening?" she asked quietly. McCrae didn't step closer. Didn't soften. "It's a misunderstanding," he said. Betty frowned slightly. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated. McCrae nodded. "There's been speculation," he continued, "about last night." Betty's stomach dropped. "What kind of speculation?" McCrae hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, "The kind that needs to be corrected quickly." Something in his tone, something in the way he said it, made her chest tighten. "And how do you plan to do that?" she asked. McCrae's answer came too fast. "By making it clear there's no personal connection between us." Silence. Sharp. Cutting. Betty stared at him. Because she understood exactly what he meant. "You mean," she said slowly, her voice quieter now, "by pretending none of this happened?" McCrae's expression didn't change. "It's necessary." That word. Necessary. It hit harder than anything else. Betty let out a soft, disbelieving breath. "Of course it is," she murmured. McCrae frowned slightly. "You don't understand the situation." "No," Betty interrupted, her voice trembling now, but not with fear. With hurt. "I understand it perfectly." A few people nearby pretended not to listen, but they heard every word. "You have a reputation," Betty continued. "A company. An image." A pause. "And I'm what?" McCrae didn't answer. Because there was no answer. That wouldn't make it worse. Say it, Betty whispered. Her eyes didn't leave his. But something in them was already breaking. McCrae exhaled slowly. This isn't about you. And that was the moment everything shattered. Betty laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was disbelief. It's never about me, right? She said softly. That's the whole point. McCrae stepped forward now. You're taking this the wrong way. Betty shook her head. No, she said. I'm finally seeing it the right way. Her voice steadied, but her hands, they trembled. You asked me a question, she said. About choices. About what I'd say yes to. A beat. And I told you no. McCrae's jaw tightened. This is different. Betty nodded. You're right, she said. Another pause. This is worse. Silence. Heavy, unforgiving. Because now, Betty continued, you're asking me to disappear, so you can stay comfortable. McCrae didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew she was right. I'm not asking you to disappear, he said finally. Betty looked at him. Then what are you asking me to do? She whispered. McCrae hesitated. And that hesitation said everything. Betty nodded slowly. I thought so. She stepped back, creating distance. Not just physically, but emotionally. You know what the worst part is? She said quietly. McCrae looked at her. I believed you, she continued. For a second, I actually believed you were different. That hit hard. I am, McCrae said. But his voice didn't carry the same certainty anymore. Betty shook her head. No, she said. A tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it. Not when it matters. And with that, she turned. Betty. McCrae's voice followed. But she didn't stop. Didn't turn back. Because some things, once broken, don't pause. They end. Across the room, the whispers grew louder. She was using him. No, he used her. It was obvious. McCrae stood there, frozen, watching her walk away. And for the first time, he didn't know how to fix it. Be honest, was McCrae wrong? Or was he just protecting what he built? Tell me what you would have done. Because this is where most people lose what truly matters. The restaurant carried on, as if nothing had happened. But for them, everything had. Because now, the connection was gone. Replaced by something colder. Regret. And silence. The restaurant didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like a memory pretending to still be alive. After Betty walked away, everything continued as if nothing had happened. Orders were served. Glasses refilled. Conversations resumed. But for McCrae, the noise had become meaningless. He stood near the same table where it all began. The same spot. The same silence. Only now, it was heavier. Sir, his assistant said carefully, stepping closer. We can still control the narrative. You just need to confirm you have no ongoing relationship with staff. McCrae didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the corridor where Betty disappeared. Sir, the assistant pressed again. McCrae finally turned. Slowly. Clear it, he said flatly. Relief flashed across the assistant's face. Yes, sir. I'll draft. Not that. The assistant stopped. McCrae's voice lowered. Calmer, but sharper. Clear everything. The statement. The denial. All of it. Silence. The assistant blinked. Sir, that would. I don't care. That was the first crack. Not in the system. Not in the empire. In him. Across the city, Betty sat alone on a small bench behind the restaurant. The noise of the kitchen faded behind her like a world she no longer belonged to. Her hands rested in her lap. Still. Too still. But her mind wasn't. It replayed everything. His voice. His words. The pause before he chose the system over her. And the worst part. She understood it. That was what hurt most. Because it wasn't cruelty. It was structure. And structures didn't bend easily. They broke people instead. "Hey," a co-worker's voice came softly from behind her. Betty didn't look up. "You okay?" A pause. Betty nodded. But it wasn't convincing. "I will be," she whispered. Her co-worker hesitated. Then sat beside her. "He didn't deserve you anyway," she said gently. Betty gave a faint, tired smile. "It's not about deserving," she said. "It never is." Inside the restaurant, McCrae made a decision. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked. Not toward the exit. Toward the back. The manager saw him first. "Sir, is everything all right?" McCrae didn't slow down. "I need to speak to her." The manager blinked. "Sir, Betty is off the floor. She's..." "I said I need to speak to her." His tone ended the conversation. Betty saw him before anyone called her. She was still outside when the door opened. And there he was. Standing in the frame like he didn't belong in either world anymore. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them wasn't angry now. It was fragile, like something already broken trying to remember its shape. "You shouldn't be here," Betty said quietly. McCrae nodded slightly. "I know." A pause. "But I am." Betty looked away first. "Did you fix it?" she asked. McCrae didn't answer immediately. Then, "No." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Then why are you here?" McCrae took a step closer, then stopped. Because too close would undo him. "I made a mistake," he said simply. Betty didn't respond. Because that wasn't enough. Not anymore. "You didn't make a mistake," she said quietly. "You made a choice." McCrae's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." Silence. Betty finally looked at him again. Really looked. And for the first time, he wasn't untouchable. He looked human. Tired. Conflicted. And it scared her more than his power ever did. "I can't be someone you pause your life for and resume when convenient," she said softly. McCrae stepped forward again. Carefully. "I'm not pausing anything." Betty shook her head. "You already did." That landed. Deep. McCrae exhaled slowly. "I was trying to protect you." Betty's expression hardened slightly. "From what?" "The truth." A pause. "No," she said before he could answer. "From consequences." McCrae looked down briefly, then back at her. "And you think I don't face consequences every day?" Betty didn't hesitate. "No," she said. "I think you choose which ones you're willing to feel." That silence. This time it lasted longer. Because neither of them could deny it. McCrae spoke again, softer now. "I didn't want to lose what we had." Betty's eyes flickered. "What we had," she repeated. A faint sadness touched her voice. "We barely had anything." That was the truth. And it hurt because it was true. McCrae took another step forward. This time, he didn't stop. "I don't know what this is," he admitted. "But I know I don't want it to end like this." Betty's breath hitched slightly. "You don't get to decide that alone." A pause. Then McCrae said something he had never said before in his life. "I don't want control over it." That made her still. Because it wasn't strategy. It wasn't manipulation. It was surrender. Betty studied him for a long moment. The billionaire. The man who built empires. The man who never bent. Standing there, choosing honesty over image. And it confused her, because it felt real. Too real. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly. McCrae shook his head. "No," he said. "I already regret what I did before this." Silence again. But different now. Less sharp. More uncertain. "I can't promise you a perfect world," McCrae said. Betty nodded slowly. "I don't want one." A pause. "But I can't be hidden either." McCrae stepped closer. "You won't be." Betty looked at him sharply. "You said that before." McCrae didn't flinch. "And I was wrong." That was it. The moment. Not grand. Not dramatic. But honest. Betty's defenses didn't collapse. They softened. Just slightly. Because something inside her recognized the difference. "I don't trust easy words," she said quietly. McCrae nodded. "Then don't trust them." A pause. "Watch me." That changed the air again. Not fully, but enough. Betty looked away, then back at him. "You're asking for a second chance," she said. McCrae answered immediately. "No." A pause. "I'm asking for a real one." That landed differently. Because it wasn't about undoing the past. It was about facing it. Betty exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I can step into your world," she admitted. McCrae nodded. "Then I'll step into yours." Silence. Long. Heavy. But no longer empty. If someone hurt you but came back completely honest, would you give them a second chance? Tell me below, because this is the moment everything could still go either way. Betty looked at him for a long time. Not as a billionaire. Not as a man in control. But as someone standing at the edge of something real. And slowly, she spoke. "I don't forgive easily." McCrae nodded. "I don't expect you to." Another pause. Then Betty said softly, "But I also don't ignore truth when I see it." The silence that followed was different. Not tension. Not fear. Possibility. And for the first time since this began, neither of them walked away. The morning after the storm felt different. Not because the city had changed, but because something inside it had. The restaurant opened early. Same polished floors. Same golden light. Same careful order. But Betty didn't feel invisible anymore. Every step she took across the dining hall carried weight now. Not from fear, but from awareness. Something had shifted. And everyone could feel it. McCrae arrived just before noon. No entourage. No announcement. No performance. Just him. He stopped at the entrance for a second longer than usual, like he was deciding whether to enter a world that had already decided something about him. Then he walked in. And immediately, he saw her. Betty stood near the far end of the restaurant, arranging a table setting with quiet precision. Same uniform. Same movements. But not the same presence. This time, she was seen. McCrae walked toward her slowly. No urgency. No expectation. Just presence. Betty noticed him before he reached her. She didn't stop working. Didn't freeze. But her hands slowed slightly. "You came back," she said softly. McCrae nodded. "I said I would." A faint breath escaped her lips, almost a smile, but not quite ready to fully exist. "You also said a lot of things that day," she replied. McCrae accepted that without defense. "I did," he said. A pause. Then he added, "And I meant the last ones." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was open. Betty finally placed the last glass down and turned fully to him. "Why are you really here, McCrae?" No hesitation in her tone. No fear. Just truth asking truth. McCrae looked at her for a long moment, then said, Because I don't want the version of my life where I never tried to fix what I broke. That landed softly, but deeply. Betty studied him carefully, not searching for perfection, but consistency. You broke something, she said quietly. McCrae nodded. I know. A pause. And I can't undo it. Betty's expression softened slightly. No, she agreed. Then, a longer pause. But you showed me something too. McCrae waited. Betty continued. That you can be powerful and still wrong. A faint, almost relieved exhale left McCrae. I've been wrong before, he said. Betty tilted her head slightly. But not like this. McCrae didn't argue, because she was right. From across the room, the world kept moving. Guests laughed. Cutlery clinked. Life continued pretending nothing important was happening. But at table 1, something irreversible was forming. McCrae stepped closer, careful now, like approaching something fragile. I don't want control over this, he said again. Betty nodded slightly. I believe you now. That was new. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but belief. McCrae exhaled slowly. So what happens now, he asked. Betty looked down briefly, then back at him. We don't pretend it didn't happen, she said. A pause. And we don't rush to fix it either. McCrae nodded. Then what do we do? Betty's expression softened just a little more. We start, honestly. Silence. But this time, it didn't feel uncertain. It felt like beginning. McCrae gave a faint nod. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not the corporate kind. Not the controlled kind. But real. Small. Quiet. Relieved. I can do that, he said. Betty almost smiled back. Almost. Good, she replied. Because I don't have patience for anything else. That finally did it. A soft laugh escaped him. Genuine. Unforced. And for the first time, the space between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like possibility. If you were Betty, would you have trusted him again after everything? Drop your answer below, because love like this doesn't come easy, and not everyone would take the risk. Betty glanced toward the restaurant floor, then back at him. You're still a billionaire, she said lightly. McCrae nodded. I can't fix that. Betty smiled faintly now. No, she said. But you can stop letting it define everything. McCrae held her gaze. And you, he asked gently. Betty didn't hesitate. I'm still a waitress. A pause. But not invisible. That was it. The balance. The understanding. The beginning. McCrae extended his hand, not as a power move, not as a command, but as an offer. Betty looked at it for a second, then placed her hand in his. Not as surrender, not as submission, but as choice. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, nothing stopped. But something had changed forever. Because sometimes, love doesn't arrive perfectly. It arrives honestly, broken, risky, real. And still, it chooses to stay. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. Your time, your support, and your presence here mean more than words can say. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or kept you watching, please make sure to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a new upload. Until next time, stay blessed, stay strong, and keep believing in love. See you in the next story.